The heat of the desert was unbearable, shimmering waves of dust rising with every gust of wind, and in the middle of that chaos a lone U.S. Army convoy rumbled through hostile territory, its radios buzzing with tension. Among the soldiers, one officer stood out, a woman whose presence was both commanding and calm under fire. She had been through countless drills, had trained harder than most of her unit, and carried a reputation of never backing down. Her name echoed quietly through the ranks as someone fearless, someone who could improvise when the rules of combat bent or broke. The mission that day was supposed to be simple: escort supplies through a volatile corridor known for ambushes, but everyone knew nothing was ever simple out there. When the first shots cracked through the air, the convoy scattered into defensive positions, soldiers shouting, smoke and dust blurring vision. The officer quickly assessed the situation. Enemy fighters were dug in on high ground, rifles blazing, and her unit was pinned down with little room to maneuver. She fired back with precision, moving her squad into cover, her voice steady over the chaos. But as the firefight dragged on, ammunition grew scarce, radios jammed, and the enemy pressed harder, circling like wolves. It was then that she realized conventional tactics would not be enough. Something bold, something unthinkable, had to be done. She made the decision in a flash, throwing her rifle aside, shocking not only her squad but also the enemy who could see her silhouette rising against the smoke. They hesitated for a moment, thinking she had surrendered, but she reached for a weapon they had never expected, a specially modified crossbow strapped to her pack. This was not an ordinary crossbow. It was part of an experimental program she had volunteered for, capable of launching explosive-tipped bolts silently, with deadly accuracy. The enemy laughed at first, mocking the sight of a soldier discarding her firearm for what they thought was a primitive weapon. Their laughter ended the moment she pulled the string, locked her target, and loosed the first bolt. The explosive struck an enemy technical vehicle perched on the ridge, igniting ammunition inside and sending a thunderous fireball into the sky. The shockwave rippled across the battlefield, silencing gunfire for a moment as everyone froze, stunned by what had just happened. She didn't stop there. With a calmness born of training and courage, she reloaded, her hands swift and steady, bolts flying one after another, each one striking with surgical precision. Enemy bunkers collapsed under the blasts, fighters scattered in panic, and the morale of her squad surged as they realized she had turned the tide. Soldiers who had been pinned now found room to breathe, to fight back, and they rallied behind her daring attack. Minutes turned to an hour as the fight raged on, but the rhythm had shifted. The enemy, once confident in their numbers and firepower, now faced a weapon they could not predict, wielded by a woman who fought like a storm. She moved with agility, ducking between cover, signaling her squad, coordinating strikes. Every bolt was more than just an explosion. It was a message of resilience, of refusing to break. Her squad advanced, reclaiming ground inch by inch, the enemy retreating under the relentless crossbow fire and the renewed gunfire of her soldiers. By the second hour, reinforcements had finally broken through the interference, guided by the smoke pillars of burning enemy positions. When they arrived, they found the battlefield transformed. Craters marking where enemy fortifications once stood, fighters fleeing into the hills, and at the center of it all stood the officer, crossbow in hand, her uniform dusted with ash but her stance unshaken. Her squad surrounded her with admiration and disbelief, telling the story already in hushed tones, unable to process how she had turned what could have been a massacre into a stunning victory. For 90 minutes, she had carried the weight of survival on her shoulders, fighting in a way no one expected, redefining courage in the eyes of her fellow soldiers. The Army would later write reports, medals would be discussed, but for the men and women who stood beside her that day, the true honor was witnessing how one decision, throwing away her gun and taking up an explosive crossbow, had saved them all. The enemy never forgot the shock either, whispering about the American woman who fought like fire, who wielded silence and thunder in the same breath, and who proved that war was not always won by conventional weapons but by the fearless heart behind them.